Hello. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming to what is our last speaker event for the PPE Society this year. I will not be giving the usual introduction today because thanks goes to Ed Livingston for putting this event together. We're very thankful to our treasurer for that. So all I'm going to do is make two announcements. The first of which is that the PPE Society AGM is being held next Monday, and we really want to encourage people to come and take over the society and hopefully improve upon some of the work we've done this year, and we can do that with some enthusiastic people. So yeah, come to that. Secondly, the format of the evening is going to be like a 45-minute talk followed by a short 15-minute Q&A or something like that. But we'll probably have to get out of here at 7 o'clock, pretty sharpish, because the PPE Society has been shortlisted for the Best Academic Society this year in Queen's, so we have to scoot over to the Student Union Awards and see how that goes. So we'll see how that goes anyway. But yeah, so I'm just going to pass it over to Ed, who's going to introduce the event, and enjoy.
Yep, cool. Yeah. Quick little Professor Gilles, Head of School of Management here. Joined Queen's from Virginia Tech in 2008, I believe. This is all of your relational economy website. Main research areas being microeconomics, game theory, its application to networks, trust and embeddedness, which I think some of us are familiar with from Dr. Baker's module. If not, we've got other two to look forward to. Yes, it's been published in a number of journals, including Social Choice and Welfare, Journal of Economic Theory, Division of Labour and Transactions Costs. And the talk here, we have Understanding Economic Competition in the 21st Century. So let's just pass it right over. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope I do a reasonable job because it's recorded, of course, so I don't know. If I say something foolish, it will be forever. Maybe I don't know whether I will be saying something foolish today. Maybe it's all nonsense anyway. So anyway, before I start, I want to say something about economics. Economics is, in my opinion, very hard to base, very hard to say that it is a science. It's very hard to look at the world in a value-free way. You always need a kind of reference, you need a kind of theoretical framework in which you look at the world. And so, since you guys are also doing political science and all that, it's very close to that, because essentially economics is ideology in some sense. And we live in an age in which a certain type of economics has really taken over, and all policy making and all governments and all world leaders are married to this particular view of the world at the moment. And I think very much that it is way too much and way too non-skeptical worldview at the moment, right? They don't ask questions about their very fundamental assumptions that they make about the world. So whatever I'm going to say today, be skeptical and don't believe any word that you hear. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a little bit about some kind of applied focus, a little bit on that comes from my theoretical perspective, and look at competition in our world. And what I really believe is that we live in a world that is not ruled by markets at all. Whatever we call markets are really networks. And when you look at things from that perspective, you see completely different things. And as a consequence, a lot of economic policies that we have in our current world, implemented by these governments, do not make sense from a network perspective. And that is what I will talk about today. So I will introduce that a little bit, and then what I will do is give you an overview of the 3 classical theories that underpin current thinking about competition in our economy. And those are all market theories. And I will be very brief about that, just to give you a taste. Then I will go to the main thing, and that is, what can we say about competition in networks? And there are 2 I have identified so far, 2 ways to look at this. And possibly there's much more to say here, but we're just at the beginning of something, and nobody really has thought about it very much. And that is a kind of static look at the world with a certain discrete way of looking at it. What is the current state, and do we have competition in that state? And could this state change to another state in which there is less competition? Right? And how do you prevent that then? Another way is to look at these networks from a more kind of competitive point of view, in sense, dynamic point of view. Can there be competitors coming into the network and take over some of my trade? And how should I respond to that? And I call that contestable minimum. But contestability is an old term from economics, and again from market theory, that comes from that it is not competition, but it could become competitive. And you have to take into account that if you do not change your behavior, that you could invite essentially competitors into the market, and so those are contestable markets, as they're called. And in networks there is a similar kind of thing there. Anyway, so it's well recognized that competition is a cornerstone of a well-functioning economy. First of all, competition is good. Competition leads to a lot of good things, and it drives down prices. That's the first thing. It reduces production costs, because if you produce at too high production costs, competitors will move in. They produce at a lower level, lower production costs, you go out of business, right? So those are good things, and in theory, there is a good effect on economic wealth generation or growth in the short run as well as the long run, when there's competition. So this is just general. I don't question these things. This is a market theory, well confirmed. There's a lot of studies on that, and I will not question that at all. So the classical perspective is one of markets, and competition happens in markets, and then you have the laws of demand and supply that regulate the price formation in these networks, and competition functions essentially through these laws. And what we have is that government regulation from very early 20th century has strictly been focused on this market perspective. So we want to regulate competition in markets, and they think in market terms about that, not in network terms. Okay? However, today it seems as if all of this is falling apart. Things are not functioning as expected. There's a lot of industries and areas have come up recently in which there is a lack of competition, and there are high prices, there is bad behavior, there's a lot of inefficiency. It is as if all these things are actually not functioning. And I'm here looking at energy sector, I'm looking at communication sector, in particular telephone and also internet, all that kind of thing. Banking, not forgetting about that, of course. Banking is one big mess. Why? Because it's essentially one hugely inefficient heap of I'm done essentially. Okay. But anyway, we really have a problem at the moment. how can we make sense of that problem, and how should we react to that problem? How can we remedy that problem, if we can remedy at all? That's the question that I want to ask. So, right, the financial crisis essentially can be directly linked to this failure of proper competition in the financial sector. If it would have worked as the market theory would predict, we would not have had a financial crisis. But of course it did not work like that. One of the most interesting things of the current ongoing crisis is that these transnational corporations remain extremely profitable, as if there is no crisis at all. And they are very powerful, and they're controlling a lot. I'm talking about energy companies, I'm talking about big corporations that we all know. They do extremely well at the moment. At the moment, there's essentially an absence of government policies in many ways. There is a little bit of competition policy going on, but it is certainly not tackling the big issues as they should. They approve way too many mergers and things like that. So what I want to propose is a different look at the economy, and that is a network look, and that we should look at the world much more from a supply chain perspective, in some sense, that we have networked economic relationships, and that these relationships are sequenced in a certain way, and that we have to look at it from that perspective. And then you can talk about the control of these supply chains. Who is controlling these supply chains? And of course I come to the same friendly corporations, transnational corporations. They're controlling these supply chains in a very clever way. And they are not doing that necessarily through the classical things that we know from markets, or that we can explain with market theory. Anyway, I will show that we have a completely different perspective when you really look at a network setting for that. Okay, what we need is a kind of level of consciousness. I really believe that when you look at history and how we come to things, that there is also something that there's suddenly a realization that we have something, that we don't look at the thing from a proper point of view, and that we really live in a different kind of world. Right? So, right? For example, Enlightenment philosophy is very much quite a trivial set of ideas, and they had huge impact on society, because suddenly we realized, yes, indeed, we can look at the world from that perspective. We can say that we are individuals, that liberty and freedom is at the center of our thinking, and that we should protect those liberties, and that we should treat people equally, etc., etc. Right? So, those ideas are a realization in some sense of something that is really around us already. Now, these networks are around us already quite a long time. Essentially, there never were no networks at all. There always were networks, but we always called these networks markets. What we should do is change the terminology and say these are networks, and we should become network conscious in that regard. And we should change, therefore, we should design our policies and what we do in our society from that perspective. So, this means for competition, for example, that we need to rethink what we're doing from that perspective. Now, networks are directly related to power. Positions in networks relate to power. It is not anymore about products, it's not anymore about commodities, it does not really matter that much what you exactly are doing. It is that you control it. That is the important thing. And that means network structure, not network architecture, or network topology, whatever you want to call it, is a determining factor here that we should look at in particular. And that is what I'm going to do. Of course, after you consider that, then you can refine that and say what kind of activities are exactly happening in those networks, and then you can refine your vision and your understanding. Alright, I will first of all talk about current practices in thinking about competition in our economy, government regulation, what is that based on? And there are three fundamental theories, classical theories, that underpin this, so to say. First theory is of perfect competition. The second theory is of Bertrand competition, or price competition, as it is called. And then the third one is a more sophisticated look at things in the sense that you abandon essentially this perfect nature of competition, which is very much in these first two strands of reasoning, and you're going to say the world is not that perfect, so we can be a little bit away from competition, but we hope that we are good enough, that things are functioning well enough so that we don't have to worry too much. There's not too much power. And that can be underpinned by a theory that is coming from an industrial organization, classical theory as well. Perfect competition is the most traditional one in some sense. It is the most pure. It's a theory that we really would like to believe in. It's like a religion. This is God. Right? So, perfect competition is the pot at the end of the rainbow. That is gold. Of course, there is nothing at the end of the rainbow, so I already give you the idea that indeed this is very hard to accomplish. It is really a theory that assumes that all firms are tiny little ants that have no power whatsoever in the market. That whatever they do not affect fundamentally the state of the market. They do not affect the equilibrium price, the price of the good in the market. They do not affect the profitability of other firms. They do not really do much at all. Right? And so we can say that they're so tiny that they don't really count. So there's a complete absence of power, and then in that situation the theory says that we have the market price completely reflecting the true scarcity of the good, the social scarcity of the good. So the price is exactly what it is worth, and that is the golden thing. And of course that is wonderful, because then you can say markets are efficient. Markets lead to an evaluation of commodities that is perfect in all respects. In this particular state, we have a perfect functioning of the market, that it leads also to zero profit state, a break even. That doesn't mean that there are no accounting profits, but we have a normal return to business, right? So it is an opportunity cost look at the world, right? I could do also something else, and if I do that other job, I could make £50,000. So zero profit means when I make £50,000, I have a zero profit, because I do not have an excess income above what else I could do. So that opportunity cost principle is very important here. Secondly, in the long term, the economy will lead to the most perfect production technologies and the lowest cost structures, etc., etc. It's all wonderful and perfect. It's really a kind of religious kind of economics. Okay, this is the second theory, Bertrand competition, and this is the phrase that describes that. 2 is enough for perfect competition. If you have 2 firms competing in prices in a market with a homogeneous good, and they're pretty identical, then price competition results in zero profits again, and you get marginal cost pricing again. The price reflects the true social scarcity of the good. And that is that the mechanism in the market, and there comes in the difficulty of course, the mechanism in the market, right? In the perfectly competitive markets, it did not matter what the mechanism very much was, because there is a mass of competitors, and so they drive whatever happens, they drive the market to that perfect state. Here, the mechanism in the market drives everything, and if they deviate from the mechanism in the sense that, for example, they do something with the good, right? I put a label on my good, and or I put a package around it, and suddenly it's no homogeneous good anymore, and people say, oh, that looks nice, it looks much better than that competitor of yours, and so they're willing to pay more suddenly for your good. So then you get a heterogeneous market, or heterogeneous goods, and then you undermine the functioning of this completely, and then you get essentially no marginal cost pricing, and therefore no reflection of the true scarcity of these goods. Okay. Still, it might not be too bad, and that brings me then to what we can call normal oligopoly. This is a more realistic viewpoint. If you have a limited number of competitors and heterogeneous goods, the market can still function reasonably well. What you have to do is to make sure that if competitors want to come in and if they want to compete with similar goods, maybe not perfectly the same good, not a homogeneous good, but slightly heterogeneous, things are still okay. So pricing is still okay, it's less than monopolistic, it's maybe not a true reflection of the true scarcity of the good, but it's still okay. Profits are positive, based on the opportunity cost principle again, but they are limited. It's all fine. It is reasonable competition. And in that case, things are reasonably going ahead. This is a kind of practice that you aim for when you do your policies. So what is my understanding, at least, of history is that government stepped into the business of regulation of markets, in particular in the 1910s, and it started with this extremely famous case of Rockefeller, who monopolized the oil market in the United States by takeovers and all kinds of dirty practices. He was a big criminal, essentially. And they had a tremendous lawsuit against him, and they broke his monopoly and smashed it into pieces. And so the corporation that was called Standard Oil was split up in multiple corporations at that time, and they still exist. And the core company, Standard Oil, became SO, and is now Exxon. And it merged again in Mobil, so it became Exxon Mobil. So that's the standard case, and that is where, when they invented antitrust policies and antitrust laws in the United States, and Europe followed quickly. Since the 80s, since Thatcher, Reagan, you name them, suddenly this turned into a kind of religious belief that things would function by themselves, and that we live there actually in a perfectly competitive world, and that everything would be fine. And since then, things have gone quite badly for everything, for all goods. Right? There's tremendous power again in the oil market, because these firms merged again. So you got very big corporations with a lot of control. They also smashed up, by the way, the second big case was AT&T in the 1970s. AT&T was broken up into multiple telephone companies. Since then, there have been mergers again, and there are too few competitors now in the United States, for example, there are only 3 main providers at the moment, or 4, depending on how big the companies are that you count. But for such a huge economy as the United States, that is very little. So there's always a tendency to merge and to clump together and to become bigger and more powerful in all those markets and all those industries. So, since the 80s, there's much more monopolistic power around, and the so-called markets are not functioning according to this idea of perfect competition and all. Right. So, what I want to question is, are these actually markets? Of course, you could say, let's go back to this here, right? And in Europe, by the way, this has been maintained as a standard. In Europe, Microsoft is fined again and again and again for bad practices. In the United States, Bush Jr. let them off the hook completely and just, please go ahead, make your monopoly. But the EU, to its credit, has fined Microsoft multiple times. Not that it is very successful with that, because they just pay the fine and then they move on and do the same thing again. My question is, are these actually markets, and can we understand things from a slightly different perspective? And what could we say then about competition from that perspective and competition policy? So what I want to talk about today is really about the structure of these networks. And these structures, they give rise to positions in those networks that are occupied by these firms, and those lead to control. And I call these middlemen. So a middleman position is one that bridges different communities in the network. So if you take away the middleman, the network would fall into pieces. So for example, here we have a network, and I have here 2 middlemen. Right? This guy here, if you take him away, 3 and 9 can no longer communicate with 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7 and 8. Right? So 5 has a middleman position with regard, in particular, with regard to 3 and 9. 6 has similarly a middleman position with regard to 7 and 8. So middleman positions are ones in which, if you take them away, the network functionality completely collapses. And of course, that means that these middlemen can charge fees, can charge markups, can get away with extracting all wealth from these networks. Right? So if wealth is generated through these supply chains or these chains, this middleman can suck it all up. And that's exactly what the analysis shows. Right? So there are 2 forms of analysis that we can do here that I want to talk about a little bit. The first one is about thickness of the network, and that is, we will try to avoid to have middlemen altogether. Let's get rid of these middlemen. Let's have networks that are thick. Right? This comes back from thick markets and thin markets. This goes back to that idea of perfect competition, that there are so many competitors and so many firms that you don't have to worry. Right? That is this idea. The second idea is a little bit more that oligopolistic idea. You need to you can also look at these middleman positions that they can be threatened. That there can be a competitor moving in that says, I'm going to contest that, what you do. I'm going to try to take away part of your profit. Right? You reap everything, you suck away everything, I will try to move in to take that away. Right? And so you have these entrants that you can consider, and that we can call network contestability. Now, you can think of a policy equivalent of this idea is then to promote the idea that easy access to these networks and easy startup of alternatives that should be promoted. But it's very hard. Right? This is a very hard idea because there are huge costs of starting up a business, and even in the most profitable cases, it's very hard to contest a very profitable business. If you say today, to name a few, Google, Facebook, Apple, try to contest any of those, it's extremely hard. Extremely hard. Now I won't talk about that as well a little bit. Let's first start about talking about thick networks. So a network is thick if there's no middleman at all. Right? And it is essentially the equivalent to this perfect competition. And all these positions are therefore powerless. You cannot extract additional rent because people have alternatives. They can go to the other store. A thick network is retail, for example. Right? In particular, supermarkets and groceries and all that, and clothing. You have a lot of competitors, a lot of stores, and if you don't like a particular store, you can go to an alternative. The other, that is from a network perspective, you can also reason from that from a market perspective, and then you can say, yeah, this is really, what you talk about is just perfect competition. Right? It's just a perspective. I don't see a lot of difference here because these retail shops operate in supply chains, they operate in these networks. And it is the place in their network that is contested or that in which you have a lot of alternatives. So that is why I prefer to call it thick networks rather than perfect competition in markets. But it is in some sense preference of how to look at the world. It is this network consciousness that I said. Anyway, are these positions really powerless? Right. So, is it really the case that when you have no middleman, that nothing can be done? There is a story to tell here that actually firms can do stuff and can make things worse by creating middleman positions from, let's say, non-middleman positions. And here comes in mergers and takeovers and all that stuff. Right? And you can think of mergers as bundling of positions. So, certain positions in networks are only one step away from being a middleman. So, if I have a position in a network and I think now of mergers, and I can merge with one other firm which is in another position, and I put them together, and then I create a true middleman position, well then I'm only one step away from being a middleman, am I not? Right? And that is where a lot of what we see around us is coming from. Right? You can control by taking over a competitor. Right? And that is also undermining this idea of contestability, by the way, because as soon as I emerge as a competitor, I might be gobbled up. And this is very common at the moment in internet businesses. There's a lot of practices going on. And this is the example, Facebook and Instagram. So, Facebook acquired Instagram at some point, quite recently, and everybody thought, why did they do that? But they were ahead of the curve because Instagram is getting extremely popular and Facebook is at the moment declining. And by taking over Instagram, it doesn't matter. Right? It's the same corporation that runs it and they have the same control. And it is all about control here because how do you make your profit? You profit by capturing everybody, getting their information, selling that information, and of course, that's also the Google practice, to let them use the links that you provide, and for every click on the link you get charged. So that is more Google practice, but Google does exactly the same, right? So you have to capture and control. That is, modern business is all about that. So here we have a nice network, for example, and we have here two positions in the middle that I can call quasi-middleman, because as you can see, if A and B merge, then we have essentially middleman. And if you completely merge that, then we get a true middleman. There we are. This is how it happens, right? So at the moment, of course, what we have is, here's Facebook and here's Instagram. But at some point they can choose that they really will be one corporation, and that they just, it becomes just a department of that. Amazon is doing similar practice. It ties in a lot of competitors very early on, potential competitors, very early on, by giving them an opportunity to advertise and to sell on the Amazon website. And so, if there is something that is popular, they are there to control that. They can control that. And they became now so confident in their business model, and so they're so powerful now that these other companies have started to complain very vigorously about the high fees that they have to pay. So fees were increased by Amazon tremendously compared to the last years for these corporations to advertise their goods on the Amazon website. So let's have some intermediate conclusions here. So what I really believe that middleman analysis can really explain some phenomena that we see around us in a very simple way by just talking about structures, not about goods, not about demand functions and supply functions and markets and how markets operate. It is a very simple story. Thickness itself, like your thick network, might not be good enough. You have to protect it. You have to be able to stop that these mergers happen and that these bundlings go on. And that is very hard. And there comes in, of course, government agencies that can stop these mergers and protect the competitiveness of these networks. Right, so that is then the next step. Regulation needs to prevent middlemen from arising. And so you have to protect these quasi-middleman positions quite vigorously through your policies. Right, and this is quite close to traditional antitrust regulation. Okay, the second view, however, over these networks, going to another problem that there is, and that is namely one that we also confronted with in our modern society, and that is a kind of exploitation, very vigorous exploitation of positions in networks, even when there are competitors, or even when there are potential competitors. So, when I look at what I get from my savings account, that's a wonderful example as well, it is as if they don't care that you have a savings account or not. You get nearly nothing for it. And you can then say, okay, that's because these banks don't need any money anymore because they have all the money they need. But you can also think of this that they don't care, because if you stay with them, you're there to be taken advantage of. And this kind of philosophy that is very much the case for ISAs, for example. If you want to get a decent return on your ISAs, you need to renew the ISA every year, again and again and again, and you have to recreate the ISA, and you have to get then the 1-year ISA at the higher rate. Right? So if you don't do that, you automatically fall back to the variable rate, in which is nothing, essentially. So if you don't pay attention and you're just loyal, you're taken advantage of. And that is more and more the case. If you're a loyal customer to a phone company, you get the worst possible contract. If you're a new customer, you get the deal. But that deal expires, and after that year, you essentially have to switch to another company to get a better deal. That is what I'm talking about. That is also a form of competition, a lack of competition in all respects. Okay, so that leads then to this idea of contestability. So, so competition can be modeled as a state of mind. Do I expect a competitor to come in? What if a competitor suddenly pops up and tries to offer an alternative to my business? How should I react to that? And the normal analysis is like Bertrand competition, and then you say, I should react to that by competing and by slashing the prices and to keep the customers happy and so on. But when you do an analysis in which you take into account that certain clients can be loyal, the answer becomes completely different. Right. So this is the standard case. Here, we already talked about that. Here we have a true middleman between one and another. This guy here extracts all gains from the interaction. He walks away with everything. Now, here we have the brain of our middleman expecting a competitor to come up. I've drawn it here as a kind of phantom, as a ghost. So is there a shimmering out there, is there a competitor? How should I react to this ghost? That's the question. And the analysis that you then do is that it leads to the conclusion that you should run away with all the money you can get. So, but it depends a little bit on the situation. If you have very few loyal customers, and you expect your customers to run all to the competitor, the analysis shows that you should just take advantage of the few people that are loyal. If you have many loyal customers, then if you expect not to be contested, so to say, if you have low expectation of contested situation, then you should still take advantage of these loyal customers, even though there are many. However, if you are in a situation that you have many loyal customers, but you're also very likely to have a contested situation, a competitive situation, then we're back to perfect competition or return competition, and then you get normal competition. So that is good for society. So a lot of loyalty, but also a lot of competitors is good. And that is what I think is going on in retail. In retail you have a lot of repeat customers. People go usually to the same stores and get their stuff at the same stores. They're very loyal, and they trust that these supermarkets price their commodities in a competitive fashion and that you pay the right price for these things. And they actually do. Right? There is not a lot of difference in pricing between these different competing retail chains, supermarket chains. Okay, So that is what I just said. Low loyalty always results in full exploitation. High loyalty and high expectation of contestation is always leading to regular competition. That's a retail story. And high loyalty and low expectation of contestation leads also to full exploitation. And that is Apple, for example. There's extremely high loyalty with Apple customers, of course. And they're taking full advantage of because they pay essentially way too much for their computers. Like me here. But then I don't like Windows, and that's really. Right. So what are the policy implications of these kind of ideas then? Right? You can ask yourself. This is very incomplete because these ideas are incomplete because there's not a lot of work done of this type. It's also work that there are many exceptions and many problems there. So it is also what kind of model do you build, and that leads to all kinds of problems. The whole thing is that you get a patchwork of things. You have competition policy is hard in a network economy. It is not straightforward. There is not one thing that we can say, oh, that always will work. What you need is a mix of tools. You need an antitrust policy, but you also need an agency that looks out and goes after things actively. You need to promote competition, to support startups, for example, and to support innovation by government subsidies and all that, to keep this competition going, in other words. So we have a real problem here, and that is that we have drifted away from all this. Well, for a while, it was like that. There was a lot of support, and there was a lot of regulation, and a lot of lookout. So there was this mix, but we have drifted away since the 80s, since that religion took over. We have been away from that. And anyway, the big conclusion here is that relying on that the world is perfectly competitive and the markets work by themselves and everything is wonderful, this kind of religious belief in that things work by themselves is certainly not enough. And we are in that state at the moment, it seems to me. Right? So we are in a kind of bind at the moment with our governments. Right? So first of all, there's this religious belief that the economy is perfectly competitive, and that it is a market economy. Right? Second thing is that these governments feel themselves explicitly controlled by the large corporations. They do exactly what these large corporations want. And look at the UK, for example. They're vigorously defending the big financial corporations in London, because they feel that if they don't do that, the economy will collapse and there will be nothing. Right? There will be Middle Ages or something like that. The second thing is that they are completely tied in with their choices from the past, how they look at that and how they finance that with the financial markets. Right? The strange thing is that, for example, rating agencies and banks or investment banks in particular are in charge of all kinds of government debt and the issuing of government debt and the delivery of funding to governments. Until quite recently, that was not the case. The governments just did it all by themselves. Right? And so, up to the 80s, it was quite normal for governments to be completely financed by the people that lived in those countries. So, the English government was completely financed and all debt was covered by the citizens of the UK, because they bought government papers. And there was no big bank that controlled these papers and were selling it on behalf of the government. But at some point, these governments started to believe that everything had to be done by the private sector and that they had to outsource that. And since then, they are in the hands of the devil, so to speak. So it was a deliberate choice that we are now completely captured by these entities. Now, the final thing is then now that after the financial crisis, we are essentially in a depression. The state of Europe in particular is very bad, but I don't think that the United States is much better. And that we look at decades rather than years to get out of this mess, if we ever get out of this mess. And that is a big if for me, because the only way that we get out of this mess is that we raise our consciousness about what we are actually doing, and that we somehow step away from this, and that we do something really different, and that's something new, and look at the world from a new perspective. And that is very, very, very hard. And at the moment I don't see it. So that is also why it doesn't matter for what political party you vote, it's all the same that you get. Right? And so people are extremely frustrated at the moment. So they vote for clowns in Italy, and they vote for these QUB guys here in the UK, and so on and so on. Because they all want somehow, they don't want this, they want some alternative. And then it turns out, of course, that a clown cannot deliver really a big proper alternative, because they never really thought about everything either. So it's just a kind of protest. And at the moment, democracy is, as a consequence, not working, because the people want to get out of this hole. Nobody is there to take them out of the hole in the political sphere, so to say. Anyway, I don't know, it's very depressing when you think of it. So on this depressing note, I will probably finish then.
Stop. Okay, well, thank you very much.